in Chicago. So, and from this corner in South Minneapolis, demonstrations and civil unrest spread around the country and around the world. What began here in Minneapolis actually has mushroomed into what scholars have estimated is now the largest protest in American history. So in the month after Floyd's death, between 20 and 25 million Americans took to the street to publicly demonstrate on behalf of Black Lives Matter. So this is the biggest demonstration in American history. So, and in the wake of these events, those intense spring and summer days, my team began fielding inquiries from all around the world, for people who wanted to know why this all started in Minneapolis. And of course, that question is going to be something that's going to preoccupy, I think, all of us here for years to come, and all of us are going to be part of that conversation. My team has been able to speak to one piece of this larger explanation, and which is the history of racial covenants and the willful, what I call the willful amnesia around this history of discriminatory housing practices in Minneapolis. And of course, that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'll start with some statistics. The Twin Cities has the highest gap in between Black and white home ownership rates for any major metropolitan area in the country. What does that mean? It means that 75% of white families own their homes, and only 23% of Black families can make that same claim. This homeownership gap undergirds a whole raft of racial disparities that afflict our community. We could go on and on and on, but I'll distill it this way: housing sits at the foundation of everything else. It determines whether you're healthy, whether you're sick, whether you have access to a high quality education, whether you have access to good transportation options that can bring you to good jobs. It determines whether your family will be able to amass any kind of wealth that you can transfer over, through generations. And since 2016, my team has been presenting a question to our community, which is, how did we get here? So if Minnesota is such a great place to live, if Minneapolis is such a great place to live, how did we get such a huge gap in this critical area? What did we do wrong, and what can we do differently in the future? So our team came together around the desire to show one thing to as many people as possible. That is that these contemporary racial disparities that I have here on the screen are not the result of some natural order. This is not some kind of immutable situation. They're not the result of something that we can't change. It was built deliberately. And we've been presenting this conversation by leading community members in the construction of a map that illuminates how developers used racial covenants at the beginning of the 20th century to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. I'm going to pause for a second for a definition. Racial covenants are clauses that were inserted into property deeds. Here in the Twin Cities, real estate developers started using racial covenants in 1910. And I'm going to show you the first deed that we found that had this kind of restriction. So this deed says, the party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. These clauses were, this clause alone was written by someone named Edmund Walton. It was attached to thousands and thousands of deeds in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But these clauses of this kind were attached to new land that was being developed to keep people who are not white from buying or even occupying these homes or property parcels. The language varies. We found at least 200 different variations just in Hennepin County, but it was always explicitly racist. I'm going to read you a couple more examples, but I want you to be forewarned that it's disturbing. No person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. So we're reading these deeds publicly and aloud because we want to avoid what we see as a mistake that many Americans have done, which is to treat race with evasion, with euphemism. Racism is not going to disappear if we just ignore it. We have to confront this hard history, this truth, if we actually want justice in our society. So it's hard to hear, though. So please, please breathe. If you look at the history of housing in the United States, these racial covenants jump out. They were so outrageous, as you can hear. They were so blatantly racist, and they were used in every community across the country. In fact, by the 1930s, the federal government was actually making their use a precondition for public underwriting of development. If you wanted, the best federal rates, underwriting rates, you had to have one of these racial covenants in place on the land that you were developing. So, and over the last century, racial covenants have been examined in dozens of books, plays, movies, poetry, art. They were the subject of countless studies and court cases, including the landmark Shelley v. Kramer case heard before the US Supreme Court in 1948 that made these covenants unenforceable. But even with all that attention, there's a lot that we don't know about racial covenants. And our team basically came together out of a desire to figure some stuff out. What did these covenants actually say? Where were they used? How common were they? How much land did they cover? And we decided to do this research in an unconventional way. We decided to harness the power of community to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American city. So what our project has been doing is it's been leading people of all ages and backgrounds in the work of mapping these restrictions. We used computers to comb through millions of property deeds to flag the documents that seem to have this racist language. For our Hennepin County map that we just completed, we recruited 3,000 volunteers who read 177,000 historic property deeds, and they found 24,000 property parcels across the county that had these kind of racist restrictions. So take a look at what all that work has resulted in. This is our map of racial covenants in Hennepin County. It's a time-lapse map that shows the way they spread through the county over time. Each of these blue dots that you're seeing appearing on the screen indicates a place that was reserved for the exclusive use of white people through these covenants. And all this blue that you'll see when the slider gets to the end illuminates these 24,000 property parcels that we've identified. So no one has ever created a comprehensive map, even though racial covenants are used in every community. No one has ever created a map of how much land they cover for any community. And as we have built this map in collaboration with community, what we found is that it's been a powerful platform for policymaking, for research, and for conversations like the one that we're going to have today. So I read you that text to show you how explicitly racist these covenants are. I'm showing you this map to show how widespread they were. These were not isolated documents. But it's also important for you to understand how powerful they were, how hard they were to resist. Covenants ran with the land, which meant that once they were embedded in a certain property, connected to a certain property parcel, they stayed there forever. It didn't matter how many times you bought and sold that piece of land. It didn't matter what you built there or what you tore down and rebuilt. Those racial restrictions remained. And anyone who breached a covenant, anyone who decided to say sell the land to someone who was named in a covenant, risked losing any financial gain from that property, because that opened the door for that property parcel to be actually reclaimed by the person who put the covenant in the first place. If someone challenged that sale, the property would actually go back to the original person who put the covenant in. And if that person was dead because it was 50 years later, it would go to their heirs. So, but one of the painful truths about covenants is that most white people supported them. They thought they were necessary. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as a basic threat to their liberty. Here in the Twin Cities, we had leaders like Nellie Francis, Madison Jackson, Lena Olive Smith, James Wardlaw, and Katie McWatt, who devoted their lives to fighting these practices. And this, again, the Twin Cities is not unique. All over the country, Black people put everything on the line to challenge them. They bought houses with covenants, they moved into white neighborhoods. And that's what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a tiny white bungalow in South Minneapolis. After they moved into the home with their young daughter, Mary, they found themselves under attack. The neighbors threatened and pleaded with them to leave. Then they marched and organized a mob. 6,000 white people, according to the description of one neighbor, showed up to terrorize the family during the summer of 1931, shooting out windows, throwing paint, and threatening to burn down the house. This photo shows little Mary with her mother in front of their new house after one of these attacks. You can see the broken window in the corner of the photo. The house still stands at 46th and Columbus. You can see it today because Arthur was able to draw on other veterans and co-workers from the downtown post office where he worked. And these friends and comrades, frankly, formed an armed perimeter around their house and kept the house from being burned. But they couldn't protect the family from violence. The Lees had to retreat and live in the basement for safety because so many people were shooting through the windows. Mary had to have a police escort to go to kindergarten. Someone killed her dog one day when she was at school. Arthur was arrested several times after threatening people who were vandalizing the house. The Lee house didn't have a covenant on it, but the proliferation of covenants in the years leading up to him buying this house normalized the ideas that led to these attacks, right? According to the logic of covenants, the Lees posed a threat to their neighborhood. And it's important to remember that all of this is going on right at the moment that the Great Depression was settling across the world and throwing 1/3 of the city here in Minneapolis out of work. So, but as these racial boundaries hardened in American cities, this threat of white violence was ever present. And it's important to understand that this was one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. People didn't bother going to court. They just called together a mob like the one on Columbus Avenue. So covenants are illegal today. They were made illegal through a series of court decisions, starting with Shelley v. Kramer, and laws ending with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But as I described at the beginning of this presentation, we're still living with the legacies of these covenants. So what did covenants do? They transformed a relatively mixed city into a racially segregated city. Covenants emboldened white Minneapolitans to harass Black residents like the Lees. Black residents, as a result of the covenants and this harassment and real estate steering, were pushed into a couple of small neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And as new neighborhoods came online, they were restricted through covenants. And the neighborhoods that have covenants on them, they're still the whitest parts of the city today. The neighborhoods that didn't have covenants were redlined. That's the federal practice that declared neighborhoods that were racially mixed to be hazardous investments for lenders. This choked off capital to those areas, making it very hard for people to get what they needed to start businesses or to buy houses. And so these two things together, covenants and redlining, work to make it really hard for people who are not white to find stable, affordable, and decent housing. You know, it made it really hard for people who are not white to buy homes. And this is important for all kinds of reasons, right? But I'm going to talk specifically about the way homeownership is a critical avenue for wealth accumulation. So this story is in no way unique to Minneapolis. This urban reshuffling, this segregation by race was occurring in every community across the country. Across the nation, Blacks, in the words of the poet Langston Hughes, were, quote, he wrote a poem that was titled Hemmed In. He said, they've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free. So Langston Hughes was writing about Chicago, but the same thing was true for Minneapolis. And I would say that 71 years later, Black people are still struggling to breathe in Minneapolis. Please, 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 I can't breathe. That's what George Floyd pleaded as he lay pinned under the knee of a police officer. So the death of George Floyd grows out of this structural racism that's so entrenched in Minneapolis. So for me, this history is personal. As Andrew said in the introduction, I'm a third generation Minneapolitan. And at the same time, at the very same moment that residents in South Minneapolis were terrorizing the Lees and other Black families, my grandparents were being welcomed to the city. My grandparents were from immigrant families with roots in Sweden. They started their adult lives with no money and little formal schooling. Two of them had been orphaned. None of them made it past the 8th grade. They worked incredibly hard. They worked in all kinds of jobs all over the region, in lumber camps, as carpenters, as farmhands, as domestic servants. And then they decided to come to the big city to try their luck. And during the Great Depression, they built businesses, they got married, and in 1942, both sets of my grandparents bought houses. This is a film that my grandfather actually commissioned to record the day that my family moved into their first home. It shows what a huge deal this was. This is before the era of handheld, personal video cameras. And my grandfather summoned everyone he had ever known to come and celebrate this moment. It was such a big deal. Thanks to our map, I now know that this home was located on a block that was blanketed by racial covenants. That black icon in the upper right-hand corner, that was my grandparents' house. The red you see is all covenants. My mother's family lived nearby, and it's the same story. The blocks there are also just covered with discriminatory deeds. So my grandparents were new arrivals. They were new Americans, but they were regarded as white. So that meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans who with similar incomes and similar education levels. So I grew up, of course, visiting my grandparents' homes and hearing stories about what it was like growing up in this neighborhood near Lake Nokomis. My parents describe how great it was to be a kid, how they were outside every day at the lake, at the creek. And really importantly, the neighborhood had really solid schools. So my grandparents, one of them made it to the 8th grade. Both my parents went to college, and my mother went to graduate school. So what my parents never talked about is the fact that this was all for white people. My parents say that they never questioned why their neighbors were all Swedish, Norwegian, and German. This uniform whiteness seemed really natural to them. Even at this moment when actually there was an influx of Black people into the city. So it's also important to understand that my grandparents bought their houses just as the United States was about to see the largest expansion of the middle class in its history. Much of this prosperity rested on home ownership, which had been really deliberately supported by new federal programs in the 1930s. These new programs basically invented the modern mortgage that made home ownership affordable for a lot of people, but it also brought in redlining. And these discriminatory policies meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. So these programs were created to benefit people like my grandparents, and like the GI Bill, they were off limits to people who are not white. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged to buy homes in a part of the city where property values climbed throughout the 20th century. Our research shows that today, 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, houses in Minneapolis, like my grandparents that had covenants, are worth 15% more than identical houses that don't have covenants. And my grandparents were able to pass this additional value on to me. When my grandfather died, his house was sold, the proceeds were distributed to grandchildren. I used my portion as a down payment on another house in another part of South Minneapolis, where I was basically looking to replicate the childhood for my kids that my parents had. Solid schools, easy access to the chain of lakes. So I'm fortunate, but not unique in this way. There was a 2019 survey by the National Association of Realtors that found that 30% of first-time home buyers had my experience, which is that they got help from family to manage the purchase of their first home. So like a lot of my peers, I leveraged the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of my children, and they're reaping the benefits of this. But because I'm a historian, my kids hear all the time about the way that their lives have been shaped by the opportunities enjoyed by my grandparents. I always say to them that we carry our history with us. None of us is unencumbered. So I want everyone to hear this. That's why I'm doing this today. I want everyone to see this. That's what our map is meant to convey. And as we have shared it, we have discovered that it helps people to see structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that is backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. Racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not just the sentiments of a few bigoted people like these protesters who picketed the 1962 fair housing hearings here in Minnesota. Mapping Prejudice is trying to help people see beyond people to see structures. We want people to understand how racist ideology has been written into the foundational documents of our community. That the structural racism undergirds our community maps, and it sorts people into zones of privilege and dispossession, which actually means that people who live next to each other can have very different trajectories depending on their race. So why do we need to know this history? We need to know this history because we need to understand why it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable today to housing insecurity. Because housing insecurity affects the health, educational opportunities, and job prospects. It's been affecting those things for generations here. Structural racism undergirds a system that was built to keep Black and brown people from owning property, to keep Black and brown people from amassing wealth. So the question is, what do we do now? I believe strongly that the time is way overdue for us to make amends. The first step is obviously remembering this history, acknowledging this history, but we can't stop there. We have to have action. So here's a place to start. You can help us by building our map of Ramsey County racial covenants. We have weekly volunteer sessions. We'd love to have you as part of this. If you come and read some of these deeds with us, what we hope you'll do is share what you learned with your friends, your family members, people you work with, elected officials. But then it's up to all of you to make sure that this awareness translates into action. So as a historian of Minneapolis, I've seen this pattern again and again. And Jeremiah Ellison actually described it perfectly in a recent New York Times opinion piece that he wrote. He said, during every crisis, well-meaning white people here make a ritual of acknowledging the city's steep inequities. It's as if people think that the mere acknowledgement is the work. The work is more than that, obviously, but to figure out what we need to change, we need to listen to the people most affected. So one place I always point people to is this policy agenda that has been developed by the Alliance, which is a coalition of housing and growth organizations led by people of color here in the Twin Cities. I think we need to acknowledge again, like, there's no magic bullet. It's going to cost money. We need to make investments in housing and schools and neighborhoods and people. But I want you all to remember what the alternatives are, right? And remember that it goes beyond money, that, and that we really need to think about this process as what Ta-Nehisi Coates says, the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. It's more than just a payout for past injustices. Reparations, in the words of Coates, is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. And that's what I hope will come out of this work, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you to talk about it today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Kirsten, for joining us this morning. Just your insights and your expertise, and certainly your passion regarding your work is really comes through in your presentation. And thank you for being vulnerable with us and sharing your experiences personally regarding why you feel a pull to doing this work. And so, I think for many of us, it's yet another example of a piece of history that we know all too little about. And I think as a result, your work is critical in our efforts and in creating maybe a better future, and certainly in our efforts toward change. We have a few questions coming through in the chat. I'll pitch those up for you.
Okay, great.
As we're talking about history and the work that you guys have put into helping us understand where we're at with regard to covenants specifically, curious to hear what's next regarding kind of the next phase of like digging out other pieces of history.
I'm sorry, say that again.
What's next with regard to your work and in digging out other pieces of history that we might think about?
Well, so right now our focus, we have basically just expanded our geographic focus we're actively mapping Ramsey County, and I see some questions in the chat about that. You can go to find out more about how to join that effort. You can go to our website, which is www.mappingprejudice.org, and click on the Get Involved tab. And we have weekly volunteer sessions via Zoom, which you all are familiar with. So the mapping work goes on. And alongside of that mapping work is excavating, I would say, the stories. I shared with you the story of the Lee family. There's so many stories from the archives that we were excavating in Hennepin County and Ramsey County to really develop a truer story of the past in Minnesota. And for me, as a very traditionally trained historian, it's been fascinating to see the way people are using that history in a lot of different activism and policymaking realms. So I believe fully in the power of collaboration, and that I am in no way qualified, for instance, to come up with new policy solutions. I know the danger of bad policy, but I am eager to share our data. A lot of what I do is sharing our data, sharing our research with people who then can apply it in whatever world they're working in. So that's some piece. And then also we just received a National Endowment for the Humanities grant that is allowing us to package up these tools so that we can share them with other communities around the country, because we've gotten a lot of interest around the country in doing the same kind of work, and we want to lower the technical bar for people, so that organizations that don't have maybe all the technical resources of the University of Minnesota can do the same work pretty easily.
It's fantastic to hear. Thanks for sharing. We have a couple, obviously, other questions coming through, and some are with regard to kind of figuring out what covenants still might exist, or if they had existed on residents that we are associated with. So a couple of questions I'm going to kind of put together. One was, how might we be able to find out if our own home had a covenant? And then related, did you see if these covenants had extended to commercial properties, residences that were used as businesses? Elaborate on that.
Yeah. So covenants were made illegal through a series. I mean, they were like the zombie things that would not die, right? So you have the Supreme Court decision in 1948. Then in 1953, Minnesota passes a law that says you can't put any new covenants in. Still didn't stop people from using covenants. Another law in 1962 in Minnesota said, okay, these are illegal, you can't use them. And then the federal government in 1968 passed the Fair Housing Act that said no one in the United States can use covenants. So they are firmly illegal, right? But they're still in the property record. And in Hennepin County, you can, if you want to know if you had a racial covenant, you can go to our map, which is on our website, www.mappingprejudice.org. And there's two different display functions on the map. There's the time-lapse map that I showed you. There's also, if you click on the tab, the Explore tab, you can put in any address in Hennepin County and find out whether it had a racial covenant, and if so, what it said and when it was put in. So we're going to have that same data for Ramsey County when our mapping process is finished there. So that's the easiest way, if you live in Hennepin County, to find out whether or not you had a racial covenant. In 2019, the legislature here in Minnesota passed a law that made it easier for property owners who find these racial covenants to do what's called discharging the covenants. Minnesota is the third state in the country to do this, and it doesn't erase these records, because as a historian, I feel like it's really important for us to, again, like, acknowledge that this happened, not erase the evidence that this was going on. But people can file a sort of an addendum to their property record that says, I renounce these covenants. I own this property, but I really, I do not support these sentiments at all. So you can do that. There's a group that we've partnered with called the Just Deeds Coalition, which is a group of people in banking and real estate, and they have volunteered to help any homeowners who want to do this, to discharge their deeds. They'll walk you through the process, which is supposed to be simple, but it's still complicated, depending on your familiarity with property records. So what was the question? I kind of just went off there.
No, that was great. I think the last part of that, the last piece of that question was, if if covenants extended to businesses.
Oh, right, businesses, right. So it could be that we haven't found that very commonly. That's a great question, and it was something we were really curious about. What we found is that developers really explicitly put this in residential property. So, it was the idea that, that to keep neighborhoods where people were living, racially homogenous, all white.
Yeah, I'm sure that there were other barriers in place for businesses, as we've probably heard of and have learned, especially as of late. A couple more questions, then we're going to get into some breakout sessions here with our folks. I'm going to combine a couple again, and it's regarding supporting your work. A couple of questions were someone was curious about, and I think a handful of us will be curious about, how do we volunteer to help
Mhm.
out? And then in a broader sense, who and what can we do to support the Ramsey County in that mapping project?
Yeah. Well, I think, Kayla, when we were corresponding about this session, I shared with you an action guide that we have made, which I would love it if you could share it with everyone in the call here. So it lays out sort of the, like if you want to get involved with mapping prejudice, and if you have 1 hour, here's what you can do. If you have 2 hours, here's what you can do. If you have 3 hours, here's what you can do. And it has links to different things. So like the most tangible thing for people to do is to volunteer to help us map covenants. You know, jump onto one of these volunteer calls, or yeah, these volunteer training calls, and figure out how to do this. And it's not just the work of doing the deeds, it's what do you do with that knowledge that you gain. So I guess I would urge all of you, and and maybe we can have some of these conversation in the discussion in the breakout groups. But I guess I urge people to not stop with just new awareness, but to then figure out how are you gonna apply this to whatever professional organization you're involved with, or your faith group, or your neighborhood, or your family, or because the implications of these practices and policies have saturated everything in our community, and there's no one silver bullet in terms of, oh, if you just support this practice, it will negate the multi-generational impacts of these discriminatory practices. So it's up to everyone to find the constellation of issues and organizations that you can support to fight for housing justice, especially, I would say, and of course, racial justice. So that's what I would say. But when I talk to people in the housing justice world, there's new initiatives now in St. Paul. There's the St. Paul just passed a new set of tenant ordinances, for governing landlord treatment of tenants. And what the director of housing in St. Paul said, please tell people about these new requirements and why they're important. Why we have to have more protections for tenants. That it's not some kind of onerous bureaucratic thing, but it comes out of this history directly of trying to get a handle on this housing crisis that we're in for people. So I guess I would just urge you, as the Chamber of Commerce, to really reach out and work proactively with an understanding, like, my job is to bring you to the point of, like, look, we have a problem, right? And it's your job as community members to figure out what our solution is. But I think for too long, there's just been too many people who have refused to acknowledge that there's even a problem, that we're this wonderful, miraculous community that has everything figured out.